And Amy, Amy, our next guest, this is really a pleasure. He is an accomplished screenwriter, a mystery novelist. That many of his novels have been turned into movies, for which he was the screenwriter. Most notably, at least in my humble opinion, True Crime, which Clint Eastwood directed. Andrew Klavan wrote a novel of the same title, upon which that movie was based. And he had an interesting op-ed over the holidays that is a forerunner to his forthcoming book, The Great Good Thing, A Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. Take a load of that. And remember that you're talking about a Hollywood screenwriter, a novelist on top of it. In it, he writes, in this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, that he talks about the materialist spell. Materialism is a fine idea, writes Klavan, but what's it made of? An idea is neither the words that expresses it nor the brainwork that conceives it. They're only the vehicles that transport the immaterial thought into the material world. So it is with the human spirit. And it calls to mind what G.K. Chesterton wrote. It reminded me, reading his op-ed and looking forward to his book, which I have not gotten to yet. But in The Everlasting Man, G.K. Chesterton wrote about the fall of Carthage. And Chesterton wrote, and this is the Punic power of the era. It may sound fanciful to say that men we meet at tea tables or talk to at garden parties are secretly worshippers of Baal or Moloch. But this sort of commercial mind has its own cosmic vision, and it is the vision of Carthage. It has in it the brutal blunder that was the ruin of Carthage. The Punic power fell because there is in this materialism a mad indifference to real thought. By disbelieving in the soul, it comes to disbelieving in the mind. And of course, this ends with, as Chesterton went on, Carthage fell because she was faithful to her own philosophy and had followed it out to its logical conclusion, her own vision of the universe. Moloch had eaten his children, Moloch, the Canaanite god. Biblical reference, of course. And I wonder if that's not what we're doing at present in our pursuit of materialism as the order of the day, secular humanism as the governing ideology. And I wonder if that's what Andrew Klavan is getting to. And I can stop wondering because we're pleased to be joined by Andrew Klavan. Mr. Klavan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And so the book, again, The Great Good Thing, A Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. Before I guess we get to the thesis of your book, what about your journey, as indicated in the subtitle, from secular Jew to faith in Christ?
Yeah, well, the reason I wrote this story is because I felt that I had come so far. That's a very long distance to travel.
Yeah.
I'm a guy who has spent most of his life working in publishing in New York and in movies in Hollywood. I've spent my life surrounded by materialism and secularism, and started out as a non-believing Jew, a non-practicing Jew. And so the fact that I made that journey suggested to me, and I didn't make it in any kind of hysterical, emotional way. There was no kind of flash on the road to Damascus. It was a long course of thinking and reasoning and reading that brought me to that faith. And it just seemed to me that all of us in some way are living in this cloud of disbelief, this cloud of secularism, and it becomes very, very difficult to see through that cloud to the light outside. And I think that I guess I felt that if even I could do it, then maybe other people could do it as well. And I think what you were talking about when you were talking about Carthage, I think it's exactly right. We're living in a world in which the whole narrative, the default setting, is atheism, or at least materialism. The default setting, it's just assumed if you believe there's something wrong with you, you're a fantasist, you're a rube, you're not one of us, you're not one of the elite. And that assumption is wrong. It's just untrue. And so it seemed to me it's worthwhile to speak out about it. It's worthwhile to talk about it.
And you're probably one of the, could be the only conservative who attended University of California, Berkeley. Is that probably correct?
Well, if that doesn't do it to you, I don't know what will.
Right. Talk about a long journey.
I mean, that is.
Yeah, we didn't even include Berkeley in it.
Yeah, but when did you realize that you were conservative? Do you feel like were you born and raised a conservative? Were your parents conservative?
Oh, no, not at all. I was raised in a, kind of typical liberal Jewish household where a Republican was one step away from a Nazi, basically. There were the Democrat, good and bad Democrats, but there were only evil Republicans. What happened to me is I moved for many years with my family to England, and I did that for a lot of different reasons. One of them was to get away from political correctness, which was driving me insane. And I moved there, and it was the experience that the astronauts had when they looked from the moon to the Earth. Remember that picture of the Earth as just a planet out there? Suddenly I got a picture of the U.S. from a long way away. My home, I saw my home from a long way away, and my perspective shifted. And I began to realize that the things that were important to me, like freedom, the individual liberty to speak one's mind, the individual liberty to believe what one wants to believe and do what one wants with the money that he earns with the sweat of his brow, all those things were under threat from the left, not the right. They were under threat from my friends, not from my enemies. And at the same time, I had gone through the Reagan era when everybody was telling me this man's an idiot, this guy's a warmonger, this guy's going to destroy the economy, he's going to destroy the world. And everything Reagan said turned out to be true, and everything he did turned out to work. And so it was just a question of observation that made me, and it was only when I returned to America and I suddenly realized that the guys who were saying the things that I believed in were the guys at National Review, Rush Limbaugh, people that were being excoriated by my buddies and my colleagues. Those were the people I believed. And so it was a big...
Oh, no.
Oh, did we lose?
Oh.
The Berkeley Thought Police got to Klavan. We will effort to get Andrew Klavan back, but I just want to go back to something he wrote in this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which is a preview of his book. This idea there's no authority to man's moral sense. He writes that everything is about the kind of scientific fact. People say they experienced an adrenaline rush, not that they were excited. Affirmation does not invigorate; it creates a quote-unquote dopamine high. People say they're hardwired for certain behaviors and programmed for others. The underlying message: a human being is a cross between a chemistry set and a computer. His action governed solely by a series of discharges and sparks. There's no authority to man's moral sense. Oh, we've got it. Andrew, are you back with us?
I guess
there we go.
The thought police cut me off.
Exactly. That's exactly what I thought happened.
Great minds think alike.
Well, I was just referencing this passage from your op-ed about the language we use to describe emotion, adrenaline rush instead of excited, dopamine high instead of an invigorating affirmation, and the suggestion that we're just, as you write, a cross between a chemistry set and a computer. There's no authority to man's moral sense, and where does that lead us?
Well, this is the thing. This is the way a narrative works. People don't understand how powerful the narrative of the age is. It seeps into our language. It seeps into all of our assumptions. I think of things like, for instance, George Washington, a man of great virtue, tremendous moral virtue, who couldn't fully understand the evil of slavery because of the narrative in which he lived. I think of people today who can't fully understand, who are perfectly decent, good people, but can't see the evil of, say, abortion because of the narrative in which we live today. And these narratives fall apart over time, and people look back and think, how did they do that? How did they have abortions at 26 weeks? How did Washington own slaves? They can't understand it. But the cloud of the intellectual cloud we live in controls so much of what we think. And I just believe that there has been a very, very powerful effort in our academies, in Hollywood, in the news industry to push this secular view of a human being as a machine, as a chemistry set, who we act because some kind of secretion happens in our body or some kind of spark goes off in our brain. And if you think about that for just a little bit, it starts to fall apart. We don't really feel excited because of adrenaline. We experience our excitement in this mortal, fleshly world because of adrenaline. But the excitement is there. The excitement is a spiritual thing. And because of the successes of science, the wonderful successes of science, and science is a wonderful thing, but because of those things, it obscures the whole realm of things that science can't touch. And scientists themselves will say this. They'll say, we solve so many problems with our scientific method that we forget that there are other problems to solve. And so when you hear scientific writers like Steven Pinker, who I think is a wonderful writer, I enjoy his stuff, when you hear them start to spout on theological or spiritual issues, you have to remember that this is a guy talking outside of his expertise. This is like listening to Sean Penn talk about politics. Sean Penn
Right.
is a terrific actor, but he doesn't know anything about politics, and he shouldn't be talking about it. And so I think this narrative, it's very important that we break through this narrative, especially with thinking people, especially with the people who teach our kids and the people who inhabit our universities, the people who make movies, the people who look at us out of our TV sets, because they're the ones who kind of create this narrative, and they themselves have been sold a bill of goods. And again, it simply isn't so. This logic of materialism simply doesn't work. And when you think it out, the minute you think about it really for 10 minutes in a row, you start to realize there's something more, there's something else, and that's the train of thought I think we have to begin to follow.
It's interesting. A few years ago, a colleague of yours, perhaps the greatest American living playwright, David Mamet, and a screenwriter in his own right, wrote a book called The Secret Knowledge. And it's similar in one respect to what you're suggesting here. This is not a rejection of science. It's just the idea that, spoiler alert in Mamet's book,
Yes.
The secret knowledge is nobody has the secret knowledge. And that's essentially kind of what you're saying, just removing the spiritual piece of it for a second. But in terms of the left's failed ideology, that there is this vanguard class of people, these elites, that know how to turn the dials and move the levers better than everybody else, and they should be in charge of everybody else. And we see where that leads, and it seems this is kind of part of the maybe temporal point that you're making.
Yes, because these are people who have a certain kind of information. If you have a dark tunnel and you shine a single beam of light into it, the beam of light will illuminate everything it touches, but everything around it goes into deeper darkness. And that's the way that science works. Science shines a very bright light on the material world. It shows us what things are made of, how they work, how they react against each other. But everything that's not material fades into a deeper darkness, and we have to remember that that's just an effect of the light. That's just a trick, a mental trick that's taking place. And the fact is, after Isaac Newton sort of invented what we think of as science, it made sense for people to think, well, one day everything will be explained in a material, physical way. But the fact is, as science has progressed, things have become much, much more mysterious. And there's much more reason to start to think about the things that science doesn't cover. Scientists themselves are starting to invent theories, like the theory of multiple universes, to cover up the things they can't explain, like how this world is so uniquely tailored to the creation of human intelligence. They can't explain it, so they think, well, there must be a million universes, and this is just the one where people, that works for people. I call that science of the gaps. They used to talk about God of the gaps when people would use God to fill in the things we didn't know. But now science is doing that because they cannot face the fact that a creator spirit, a loving creator spirit, is invested in every aspect of human life and the human experience. And again, when we consult our own common sense, when we consult our own experience, when guys like atheists like Sam Harris or Steven Pinker come along and tell us, you're just a machine, you really have no free will. Consult your own experience. Does that have any kind of connection to the life you live and the way you live it? Of course it doesn't. We all know we make choices. We all know there are consequences to those choices. When somebody says to you there's no such thing as good and evil, and this is what our children are being taught in our universities, when somebody says, there's no such thing as good and evil, it's relative, does that make any real sense to you when you stop and think about it? When I talk to 19, 20-year-olds, they always give me this, well, good and evil is just what we believe, other countries believe other things. I just stop them and just say, okay, let's talk about like a Nazi torturing a living child versus a priest giving a beggar bread. Are we really going to say there's no moral difference there? And of course they're not going to say that. It just doesn't make any sense. And if human life means anything, if it's not just this irrational spinning into nothingness, then things make sense the way we experience them. Something about our experience is real. And I just think that they lose that. They follow a trail of a certain kind of logic into insanity.
Well, speaking of all these liberal universities, how do you feel about all of these safe spaces and things that we've done to coddle the young adults?
Well, if you think If you think there's no such thing as reality, and you think there's no such thing as right and wrong, then the only thing there is your precious feeling. And your precious feeling becomes everything, that matters. I went to university as the change was coming, but I still believed in searching for the truth, trying to find the truth. You never get to the truth. You get there by half stages, but you get closer and closer. I believe that you can get closer and closer. Of course you can. But these guys have nothing. They have nothing to believe in, nothing to work toward, no guide, no northern star to guide their life by. So the only thing that's left of importance is the way their feeling state. And if I speak the truth and that truth offends them, then the truth to them is less important than their offense. It makes perfect sense once you take out of it once you take out reality, everything you believe in makes perfect sense. Once you put reality back in, once you put moral truth back in, then they start to look like the silly snowflakes they are.
I wonder if what impact the conversions of accomplished writers like yourself, like David Mamet, do they have any impact in Hollywood or in publishing circles? I mean, because you're a very smart, accomplished guy. Mamet is a very smart, accomplished guy. Every people of all ideological stripes enjoy your work and Mamet's work. Just to use another example, do you get anybody that says in those circles that says, "Boy, you really gave me something to think about," or is it just impenetrable?
I think it does have an effect. What it doesn't have is like a flash effect. It's not like a grenade going off. But the minute David Mamet wrote that piece in the Village Voice many years ago saying that he has changed his opinion, I immediately wrote a piece in the LA Times celebrating that. Because I realized how important it was that a cultural figure of that magnitude had made that change. Of course it makes a difference. And it only makes a difference, of course, if we speak out. It doesn't make any difference if we keep our mouths shut and we think, I won't get this job because if I open my mouth, I'm going to lose this job or not, get these bad reviews. Look, if you ever read the New York Times, though I'm not sure why you would, but if you ever read the New York Times, they will go after. They gave David Mamet's next play after he announced he was a conservative. They gave it 2 bad reviews. They reviewed it twice.
All of a sudden, he can't write anymore.
They are protecting this narrative because it's only under this narrative that the state becomes all important. It's only under this narrative that experts matter. It's like once this narrative falls apart, a whole rationale for the power of the powerful disappears, which was kind of what Jesus was telling us. He was telling us that the little last shall be first if you get it right. And I think that. I think it definitely matters. And by the way, I just want to add that I feel very optimistic about this. I feel that this moral relative perspective is falling apart on its own internal logic. And there are good people in universities, there are good intellectual people who are eventually going to stand up and say, you know what, this isn't making any sense. And once that starts to happen, I think the whole ball will unravel. And I really am looking forward in the next, not too long from now, in a kind of a new American revival among the intellectual classes that I think will trickle down to other people. Because one of the great problems we have is that those people who believe, and by the way, more educated people believe than uneducated people, too many of the people who believe won't preach what they practice.
Yes.
They don't want to say, this is the truth and we should take a look at it because they're afraid of being judgmental or being attacked.
Well, this is why it's so important that people like you speak out and write good books like The Greatest Good Thing, A Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. The author, noted screenwriter and novelist Andrew Klavan. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. Really a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.